Dear audience, welcome to this panel on threats in the air. I think drones and 5G networks are hot topics nowadays, definitely in the cybersecurity area. So therefore, I'm very honored to present you all to this wonderful panel, specialist in this field. We're going to have a 25 minutes talk for each of the panelists, and I would like you to remember all the questions you have, because at the end of the session, I will open the floor to all of you, and you can ask questions to individual speakers or to all of them. So the first speaker is not a speaker, actually it's a team of two speakers. One speaker is unfortunately not able to come to Tallinn, but he will join online from the US. But we have Dr. Jason Staggs here, and he is a cybersecurity researcher and adjunct assistant professor of computer science at the University of Tulsa. An active researcher with specialties in telecommunication security, embedded system security engineering, and reverse engineering. Jason has spoken at national and international conferences, authored various peer-reviewed publications, and lectured undergraduate and graduate level courses on a variety of cybersecurity topics. He serves on the review board of Black Hat USA and is editor on the Critical Infrastructure Protection book series published by Springer. So the other colleague, Dr. Conor Benner, is a cybersecurity researcher and an active duty Army artillery officer in the US Army. His research interests include unmanned aerial systems, penetration testing, radio frequency reverse engineering, and cyber policy. In his spare time, Conor enjoys flying in the skies as a private pilot. He holds a PhD in computer science from the University of Tulsa, where he was an NSF Cyber Corps scholar and a Truman Scholar. Jason Staggs and Conor Benner will present on their paper, Leveling the Playing Field, Equipping Ukrainian freedom fighters with low-cost drone detection capabilities. This paper goes about reverse engineering commercial drone command and control protocol and show how the Russians used this asymmetric advantage in their war. Please, audience, enjoy the talk of Mr. Conor and Mr. Jason Staggs and Conor Benner.
All right, well, thank you for that introduction. It's an honor to be here on stage in Estonia along with my fellow panelists, so thanks again for the opportunity to be here. So the fundamental premise of our paper is centered around the unintended privacy consequences associated with the remote identification requirement for drones that is being mandated by various aviation regulatory bodies around the world for public safety purposes. So the requirement states that drones need to be equipped with a transponder capability that will broadcast information about the drone while it's in operation. So this includes things like a unique identifier for the drone, like a serial number perhaps, the drone's airspeed, altitude, its location, and importantly, the location of the drone operator, so the person who's actually flying the drone. Now, this has been a point of concern amongst some privacy advocates over the years who have pointed out that there could be the potential here for abuse under certain situations and scenarios. Unfortunately, we have seen these concerns turn into reality with regards to the conflict in Ukraine, where it appears that Russia has been abusing this remote identification technology for their own military objectives and to target Ukrainian civilians on the battlefield who are otherwise just trying to provide humanitarian aid and support. So there's been a handful of media reports stating that Russia's been using the DJI Aeroscope system to do this. So DJI is a Chinese manufacturer. They make consumer-grade drones. They have by far the largest market share. So Aeroscope is DJI's proprietary solution to decode and monitor their proprietary implementation of remote ID beacons. So the Russian military, according to these reports, have been using this system to target Ukrainian operators who are flying the drones. Now, the reports go on to suggest that DJI might be providing Russia with unfair advantages in terms of the acquisition process. So these Aeroscope systems are not easy to come by. They're expensive. The price point starts off at $10,000 and goes up from there, depending on what version that we're talking about. And they're only supposed to be made available to sworn law enforcement personnel and government agencies. Additionally, the report suggests that DJI is providing a specialized version of these aeroscope systems to the Russian military, ones that have better performing capabilities. So if all of this is true, there appears to be an asymmetric advantage that Russia has enjoyed thus far in the conflict. And so the question then becomes, how do we go about negating this advantage? Can we build a low-cost alternative to aeroscope using relatively cheap software-defined radios and open source software so that anybody can stand up their own monitoring capability and take the actions they deem necessary to protect a town or a neighborhood in Ukraine, as a for instance? So the answer to this question is yes, we can do this, and we have. And here to talk more about that is Connor Bender. Connor, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jason. So I think it's important to note when we're talking about DJI Aeroscope, they first marketed this device 2017, and they were they were pioneers in remote identification. And the US's FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, basically kind of took advice from DJI on how to implement a remote identification for drones. So DJI was the pioneer in this, and so they had a lot of kind of say in where the policy went and the direction that remote ID took. One of the claims that DJI did back in 2017 when it was selling Aeroscope and talking about equipping remote ID with its drones is that it claimed that it was encrypted, that only its devices, i.e. Aeroscope, could implement and intercept remote ID, claiming that it was encrypted. But over the years, while the means to capture remote ID from DJI have been difficult and you need to know some of the parameters, it's not encrypted actually. What we've learned about it is it's loosely based on LTE demodulation standards. And so if you know some parameters and you have some, tech savviness and radio frequency reverse engineering, you could relatively simply decode DJI's remote ID. And so the fact they were marketing Aeroscope initially, in this way, was just kind of like what we presume is to be a money grab. But some security researchers, figured out, that DJI drone ID was actually not encrypted. Back last year, there was kind of an open source effort that was initiated to figure out more about how drone IDs kind of work. And so the main premise was to figure out, remote ID, how to, in post-processing, once you capture this signal, just to demodulate it and decode it, after the fact. And so on GitHub, there was this open source effort that was spearheaded, and it talked about how to use, an expensive software-defined radio to, be able to, just out of pure luck, kind of go on different frequencies and, record data and then demodulate it and post-processing, after the fact. And so Jason and I's goal was we wanted to build something that was cheap, that could be accessible to freedom fighters such as Ukrainians. We wanted it real time, something like Aeroscope, but a lot of the things that open source effort we're doing wasn't real time. It was, after the fact. We wanted something on the fly, and we wanted it to kind of replicate Aeroscope, but we wanted to be able to own the hardware and the software. Just, we don't know exactly how, DJI Aeroscope works, and we were skeptical, to use such a device, with some of the claims that have been brought at the company and in the Ukraine-Russia, war effort. So we wanted something where we could own, the source code, so we knew exactly, what was being, sent in and sent out. So just, from the technical, a cheap SDR, it was a Lime SDR. They called it good. So I just kind of had different drones, DJI, and on different, I would see as you can see highlighted in the red box, different drone IDs that would pop up. And so we found the first thing was we needed to figure out where remote ID was being broadcasted on. And so we found just with various, DJI drones from Mavics to Phantoms to all the like, that it kind of was being broadcasted on 13 different frequencies. So I want to make this note that it's not in the command and control data stream. These are being broadcasted out of band, separate just from, whenever you're connected to the drone with a controller, you send it up, down, left, right, pitch, yaw, roll. It's all separate from that. So it was very easy to, not have to filter out the noise because it was just being broadcasted on its own thing. And the purpose of this slide is to show that it's not a relatively easy or simple thing to get a drone remote ID, especially using, cheap SDRs. And so the first part of the methodology is you have to identify, once you have a capture. So, we wanted to try to do this real time. And so in our real time experimentation, on the fly, you need to find out where the start of the drone ID is. It sounds like a very relatively simple thing, but doing this, with cheap SDRs, with cheap computing power, it was very critical to, make sure we had, the correct resources allocating just to find the start of the drone ID. And so we're able to get a length of that. And then we can start applying a lot of the reverse engineering techniques, with, a bandwidth filter, offset corrections. We were able then to extract some of the symbols. We can measure the channel impulse rate. And then we basically are, turning things into bits, into IQ data, essentially. And then from there, you can turbo decode, just kind of and rate match, just like how LTE, the protocol does. And then you finally get a drone ID. And in our research, we identified 3 different packets that drone IDs would do. And so I'm going to spend a little bit of time just talking about, what exactly is the drone broadcasting, just for average Joes like me to see, basically. And so the first type of packet is a license plate packet. And mind you, we found that these drone IDs, they would be broadcasted on, like I mentioned, those 13 different frequencies, out of band. It would first start off with a license plate packet, essentially. It's just kind of like it's just to, notify, in the spectrum that, hey, I'm alive, I'm a drone. Here's my serial number. Here's a license, so essentially kind of like a license plate for a car. That would be emitted. And then there's a field for a plan. So in the DJI Go app, when it's an interface that you connect with the drone where you do the command and control, you have an option to input kind of free text, essentially, of what your plan of the flight is. And so some common examples I saw of the plan field being used was the companies. They would often put for videography, things of that nature. And so just that's a very relatively simple packet. It would be also we like to call flight information packets. And so depending on the type of drone that you had, there was 2 different versions of it, version 1 and version 2. And so version 1, it starts off again with the serial number. And then you can go and you see it's followed by the drone longitude, then the latitude, then you have the altitude, height, and then it gets into some telemetry data. So like the speeds on the X, Y, Z axis, pitch, roll, yaw angles. And then it just has it's called the home, longitude, and latitude. So on the old really implement pilot, this essentially is for these older drones, because once you boot up, it will it will set its current home location, RTH. And so that's basically kind of where the pilot could be moving, mid-flight if it wanted to, but, generally in that direction, generally in this would typically be. And then it's followed by something called the UUID, the user unique identifier. And so this is a DJI specific string that doesn't pertain to any other drones. So are required to be registered with the FAA. And then the UUID is, of course, DJI's own identifier. And so what this string is essentially, it's kind of like whenever you get a new drone and you have to download DJI's app and you have to register the drone to your own account. And so basically, I can have but share them with my email address on DJI's website. Each drone will be assigned this UUID. And so take a scenario where some maybe agency is using Aeroscope and they detect a drone and they want to know more about the operator. But not only do they have the location of it, the UUID essentially, if they gave that string to DJI and asked, for them to query it, they could give a ton of different information about that user, just depending on, what the relationship, that agency has with DJI. We're talking about the email address of the operator, home addresses, financial information, anything that's tied to, your DJI account. So that's just that little string can also just be a segue. And then version 2 of the packet is extremely similar. So see a pilot GPS clock, which is basically assesses the accuracy of the phone's GPS. And then we can see it's followed by the pilot longitude, latitude, and the home longitude, latitude. So in addition, the newest version of these flight information packets not only has the return to home location that version 1 had, but it also will be constantly updating the pilot location as well. So if the pilot moves during flight, which is, a very common thing, if you're trying to, maintain visual line of sight, you might move, closer to the drone, any scenario. And so we get 3 different locations that this remote ID will emit. Also followed by the UUID, which we've discussed. So this is our cheap detection system setup that we put together. And so this was housed in a room at the University of Tulsa, Jason and I's university that we graduated from. But you can see on the left, there's this big omnidirectional antenna. And so I had it hooked up to 2 Hack RF1s, which are like one of the best and cheapest software-defined radios that you could find. And so I had that plugged into a Mac Mini. It was just a very cheap laying around and into a Pelican case. So it's a portable solution. So, DJI, its Aeroscope, its mobile unit did come in a Pelican case of sorts. So I wanted to kind of try to mimic that and try to make a cheap portable solution as well. Detection. So we left. Okay, so our experiment was we left the system run and found a lot of different detection things captured. And one of them in particular that I thought was a really good example was in our courtyard of the university. We captured, you can see a drone. It's the blue icon. It's flying over on that just kind of flying the drone, just I think for leisure, recreational use. But our detection system was able to capture that away, and that was about 0.3 miles away from where the device was at. But as you can see, like we redacted the serial number and UUID just for privacy's sake, but we were able to extract a flight information packet version 2. So it had the drone longitude, latitude, the GPS clock time, the pilot location, and the return to home location as well. You'll notice though the pilot longitude on the screenshot says 0. So I put this on here to show that remote ID sometimes like isn't perfect. Sometimes it kind of fails in transmissions or it leaves some fields blank. But like remote ID will be broadcasted every 200 to 400 milliseconds on a different frequency band, and usually a lot of the times it'll self-correct and have a different. Will have the pilot, it'll have that missing value in the next thing, but something else might be missing. And what Aeroscope does and what our detection system does, it saves and stores that and just will update the values, as they come in. And some sample results. So it was kept in a room. We would like to have had the antenna maybe mounted, outside, just to get maybe, better, just for some better results. But just indoors alone, just having this run for a week, we were able to detect a lot of different drones with various packet types. 0.3 miles away was a common one. The furthest one that we got just with the system was 3/4 of a mile away. And so while this is a proof of concept, it is a real working proof of concept. DJI Aeroscope can detect ranges up to 20 to 30 miles, right? But some of the systems cost up to $40,000, and this one was less than $1,000. And so just with additional money and funds, you can increase the detection ranges. And so that is future work for us. Is we want to be able to increase ranges while keeping the cost as cheap and as low as possible. And DJI is not the only drone that's in the commercial airspace right now. There's several. While it is by far the biggest majority, it takes up the biggest majority of the airspace. There's other things like other drone manufacturers like Parrot. And in the U.S., by September of this year, actually, unless you're flying drones like for recreational use, all drones must be equipped with some remote ID capability. This could be self-built into the drone, or it could be an apparatus that's attached on, or a module that's emitting remote ID. The requirements for remote ID are much less than what DJI is giving out. It's about maybe half of the required fields are about like a half of like what DJI is pushing out. But that will be a reality. And so once September comes around, drone companies will have a robust remote identification. I like to marry all those remote ID detection module. And Jason and I talked, and we would like to push source code out to interested parties, just individual requests. We just ask that if you email us, we would be able to work with you and maybe help increase detection ranges and just kind of give you a step-by-step methodology on what we did. And with that, we are done.
Yeah, thanks indeed to Jason and Conrad for this wonderful presentation. I said before, the questions will come afterwards. Next in line, I want to welcome Dr. Martin Strohmeier, who is a senior scientist at the Swiss Cyber Defense Campus and also a visiting fellow of Kellogg College, University of Oxford. The main focus of his work has been the analysis of cyber physical systems and networks, specifically those in critical infrastructures in the air, in space, or on ground. Martin is also a co-founder and board member of the aviation research network OpenSky. Before coming to Oxford in 2012, He received his master's degree from Technical University of Kaiserslautern in Germany and joined Lancaster University InfoLab 21 and Lufthansa Aviation Group as a visiting researcher. Martin Strohmeyer will present on his paper, Modeling 5G Threat Scenarios for Critical Infrastructure Protection. By using the STRIDE threat classification model, he will advise on some mitigations and security controls on 5G networks. So, Martin, the floor is all yours.
Thanks a lot for the introduction, Erwin, and thanks for having me again this year. My name is Martin Strohmeyer. Erwin has introduced me very nicely, thanks. This is work on modeling 5G threat scenarios for critical infrastructures. It's joint work with my colleague Vincent Lenders, who is here with me. Also, some of my other colleagues at the Swiss Cyber Defense Campus, William Blonay, who's also at the NATO CCD COE at the moment, Alain Mahmoud, also Gerrit Holtup from Kudelski IoT Security, as well as Jean-Pascal Chavan from the Swiss Federal Department of Justice and Police. So we have a paper in the proceedings. I definitely recommend you check that out because there it's all detailed out, right? Much more information than I can give you in this talk. But we will try and give you the rundown here. Of course, 5G topic, the first thing everyone here thinks about is geopolitics, right? Particularly if it pertains to cybersecurity. Over the past few years, several NATO countries, including Germany, who are thinking right now about excluding several countries, manufacturers from their 5G networks and the procurement. We have, of course, seen this in the US, in Canada, and also in the UK over the past few years. So all these NATO countries decided certain manufacturers should not ideally have access to our 5G infrastructure now or in the future. This is not entirely trivial, as we see here. With the UK, effectively, they've just extended the deadline for this to happen to 2027, because it's really not trivial, but it's something that everyone is considering as a major threat. However, that's not the only threat, right? We looked at this more holistically at what can happen besides manufacturers and besides the headline news in critical infrastructures in particular. Motivation here is that many critical infrastructures right now or in the future will depend on 5G. We have aviation that's moving from a lot of legacy systems that we've talked about at previous CyCons, at least on the ground, to communication exchanges with using 5G. We have emergency services, law enforcement, who are moving from very old legacy systems, such as Tetra, to 5G communication systems in some countries. We have the military who's planning to use 5G in field deployments. And we have a lot of industrial control systems, SCADA systems, that are using IoT connectivity in the field using 5G. As we've talked about at many CyCons, wireless systems are often insecure. We have a lot of legacy systems that have been built in the 50s, 60s, 80s, 90s. And as we've even seen in the previous talk today, a lot of them haven't built with any security in mind. They're not encrypted. You can easily look at them. The good news is 5G is better. Mobile phone networks are better than all these really bad wireless communication systems. That's mainly because we have quicker update cycles. The consumer tech, it moves much faster these days than military critical infrastructure systems. We can update 5 years, 10 years to next generation. We can update our mobile phones every year. So we have typically more security here than in, say, an aircraft that's very difficult to update. However, the downside is if you have a new system, it may not be yet too well explored. And we will see some of this. First important thing, of course, for any threat modeling is to consider your threat actors. We typically work with these 5 different threat actors. On the one hand, the extreme, we have a nation state. Of course, these may be able to influence manufacturers, get even backdoors in your 5G infrastructure, So that's, I think, well known. These things are always possible. But with the rise of consumer technologies, software-defined radios, just as the ones we've heard in the last talk, a lot of people can now have access to wireless communication. You can have these cheap software-defined radios, you can download some software from the internet or ask somebody for the source code, or develop it yourself. And that means that a lot of passive actors, script kiddies, hobbyists are also now able to listen to and interfere even with wireless communication, including 4G, 5G. It is very easy to go 3G, 2G. Keys are leaked, everything is online. Anybody can illegally but easily listen to 2G, 3G communication using software-defined radios. So we have to consider also these threat actors with different motivations. Of course, we have cyber criminals, cyber terrorists, which have access to the same resources, of course, and different motivation. Now, let's go into some of the known security issues of mobile phone networks. Briefly mentioned 2G and 3G, but of course we have a lot even in 4G, and this is what we're all using now, as we will still see. Not exhaustive, but 4 points that have been identified as critical problems in 4G specification, and to some extent at least been addressed later in the 5G specifications. First, we have symmetric network keys used in the home network in your wireless communication. So symmetric key, symmetric encryption, if you know, if that key leaks, you can impersonate the network, you can impersonate anyone on the network. That's very straightforward. Second one, probably you've heard of this one too. There's an IMSI ID in your phone, in your SIM card, right? And that identifies you globally. This one is sent in clear text over the radio. Anyone can take software-defined radios, listen to it, start tracking you globally. This is not just law enforcement, right? This is anyone can do this. Third, we have the fact that there's no end-to-end authentication really in between your user equipment, between your phone and your home network. So you can have IMSI catchers, these are well known. You can have roaming networks, and there's all sorts of shenanigans that you can do in between because you are not authenticated, or the serving network is not authenticated to you. And fourth, we also have no integrity protection on the wireless links between the phone and the radio network. So this enables standard attacks such as replay attacks, which are typically precursor or enabler for more complex threats. So there's some new security features in the 5G specifications, partly in response to these problems. The important point is that 5G is really based much more on software than previous generations. So it's not all some one big globby thing of software and hardware that's proprietary anymore. No, you're much more flexible. You can run on more custom off-the-shelf, commercial off-the-shelf hardware. You can do a lot of different software things, such as network slicing, where you can divide several bits of the network using, for example, virtualized networks. That means law enforcement can use the same infrastructure on the 5G radio link as you as a consumer, and still you cannot easily interfere with each other because you're compartmentalized effectively and don't communicate with each other. So besides network slicing and virtualized networks, we also have additional encryption authentication built in the 5G specification. We've seen why. Particular response is that tracking is not as easy. We have new implementations that give you temporary subscriber IDs, so you don't have this one global ID that can track you everywhere over time. It's much harder to track a single cell phone in a 5G specification. Besides this, we also have transport layer security. That's also quite helpful because it protects us from replay attacks. However, there are two big issues. I've alluded to that It's a relatively new specification. And we're still in the deployment phase, of course, and there's a lot of ongoing research. This is just what came out this week. I had a look at the Wireless Security Conference running this week, and there are 3, 4, 5 different papers just looking at relevant 4G, 5G issues, security issues, exploits. The first one I think is quite interesting. Recommend you check it out. These researchers, they just took implementation. They looked at their 5G deployments in Spain and saw, well, this is not 5G. We can run all of the issues that we had, all of the attacks that we had in 4G. We can run the same attacks in our 5G deployments right now. So we can use IMSI catchers. We can track the IMSIs. Everything is still there. They even correlated this with some previous research in China, which was just the same. Second one is a good example of enabling access to these, well, to 5G, to 4G, LTE, to these networks for research, but essentially for everyone else, right? So these people wrote a sniffer for LTE, for 4G, and with that open source, you can easily listen to the communication. Finally, you have some people looking into the framework in 5G for lawful interception. So if that's something that interests you, I also recommend you to check it out. The second big issue is that we have to, again, meet reality here, right? As alluded to briefly, we're not using 5G. It's very unlikely that you're using 5G if you see 5G on your phone. There's very few exceptions in Europe and in the US. You can see T-Mobile US has started with they have a 5G standalone network that is not dependent on 5G. They started this in 2020. Some other Canadian and American mobile network operators have started to do this as well, really very recently. So these networks are not widely deployed. In Europe, yeah, it's not a good situation. According to this source, at least, people started slowly in 2021, 2022. You see a couple of operators in Germany basically starting to deploy 5G standalone networks. There's a few more examples in Asia. It has been ongoing. But overall, and this is what you can see on the right here, investment up until the end of 2020 was exclusively in non-standalone networks of 5G, and only then a minority of the investment is in really building purely 5G networks rather than extending 4G networks. Because that's what's happening. So in a 5G non-standalone network, what's really happening? What's new here, right? Essentially what you have is all the same 4G network core, the evolved packet core. You have 4G radio stations. They're all still there for compatibility. And then you add on new 5G radio stations into the same network, into the same cells. These 5G radio stations then will communicate all the user data with the evolved packet core. But apart from that, all the control data, everything is still done over 4G. And as we've seen, or as some of these other researchers have shown, you can deploy all of the same 4G attacks because it is really, apart from the radio front end, 4G. Just as an aside, this is also quite interesting for some applications in SCADA and IoT systems. If you have to deploy both 4G and 5G interfaces in a small low-power device, that of course adds complexity, cost, right, and power requirements. So a lot of these people, for the time being, will use 4G anyway and not deploy both radios in such systems. This brings me to the threat modeling in our paper. We used, as Erwin has already said, the well-known standardized stride methodology. I'm sure you're familiar with that. It's been invented by Microsoft in the 2000s. Stands for, briefly, spoofing, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, and elevation of privileges. It's a framework It helps you think about threats, model them, and provides basically guidelines for the modeling, starting with the definition of the perimeter of a system up until even proposal of mitigations after you have identified the threats. We define the threat as a possible danger that might exploit the vulnerability to breach security and therefore cause possible harm in the end. We have extracted these 5 different components from 5G. We look at the external entities, we look at the processes being used, we look obviously in data and key storage, at the data flow, and finally the devices, the end user devices. And then we can categorize the different threats and see to which component they apply, as described in the table here. So for example, for the data and the key storage, only the tampering, the information disclosure, and the denial of service would be relevant threats. Armed with this, we can then go and identify the different threat scenarios to all the components in more detail. I'll briefly talk about some of the main ones here, the critical ones. The rest is, as I mentioned, in detail in the paper. The first one is the UDM database theft. Then we'll talk about vulnerabilities, in particular in the G node B and the 5G base stations, yes, and then in the 5G core afterwards, and followed by possibly leaking or stolen keys of the link encryption. So the first one is the Unified Data Management Database. This is a database that you have as your mobile network operator, and it holds your keys, of course, right? And as you mentioned, we improved from having only symmetric keys, symmetric encryption. We're now using asymmetric encryption, so you have the public key of your mobile operator in your phone, in your SIM card, but obviously the network operator still has private keys. If these were to be leaked, and we know from a lot of precedents this happens over time, right? Might be insider attacks, you might have somebody finding side channels on your cloud virtualization, you might simply get access to the hardware and extract it. It's possible, it will happen in the end. And unfortunately, there's not necessarily a process to, at that point, easily update all of the keys in the end user systems. Think also of all the embedded systems somewhere, right? It's not trivial to exchange SIM card keys, everything. So at that point, it would probably be best to update your root keys. But you can do some mitigation measures, of course. You can guard the physical access. You can do what you do typically against insider threats, right? But it's a possibility, and if it happens, it's certainly a critical one. The second one are software vulnerabilities or malware inside the 5G base stations. This is, of course, linked to the geopolitical concerns in the beginning, right? Because we can have all sorts of software vulnerabilities. These can come from standard bad coding, bad development, right? These can be planted backdoors by the manufacturer, by someone later on in the supply chain process. These are things that regularly happen that we see in the wild. You can, of course, try and mitigate this. You can only use trusted hardware, trusted manufacturers. If you can, the manufacturers themselves, of course, they can try and use hardware security modules. They can use secure boot process, secure development processes. But in the end, like in every system, every software system, there will be vulnerabilities. And when this happens, of course, you can control a lot of the communication or even run a denial of service attack. The third one is very similar fundamentally, because you can, of course, not just have software vulnerabilities in the base station, but you can also have them in the backend, in the 5G core. If that happens, then, of course, you have access potentially to the whole network, or at least to some network functions. Mitigations are roughly the same. Finally, we have the potential that there's that the keys protecting the link between different network functions are being stolen. This can again happen somewhat similar to the UDM database theft. Keys can always be stolen. can be extracted from the hardware, right? You might have some zero-day exploits. This is all possible. Again, side channel attacks against cloud implementations. So another threat scenario to be aware of. In terms of mitigation, there's one thing that I do want to speak about, and this is the OpenRAN initiative. Historically, there are a few large vendors, they're all known in 5G, of course, and we'll actually hear about it in the next talk a bit. They're very influential in 5G infrastructure, right? You have proprietary systems, you have proprietary software, hardware. You have to trust these vendors. And this is at the root of these geopolitical problems, of course. They control the hardware, they control the software. Even if they gave you the source code, if you're a mobile network operator, do you have the possibility, do you have the opportunities to check all that and make sure that it's secure, there's no backdoors? Probably not. So ideally, or typically the IT security community advocates for open systems that can be checked more easily. And it's a bit harder to hide some backdoors. So this is what the OpenRAN Alliance is proposing. They have an open architecture. No single vendor controls the system that you have. You can even mix and match different systems because it's even more software-based than 5G is already. You can use commercial off-the-shelf hardware, run different software implementations, and then combine everything to a functioning 5G standard. It's a thing already. There have been some trailblazers, Rakuten in Japan and Telefonica. But by now, more than 32 network operators have committed to ORAN in one way or another. So there's a lot of people who think this is a good idea. And if this is not happening in your country, you may look into this direction. Because it's also a way to depoliticize the rollout of 5G. So what we see in the beginning, all the geopolitics, if you have more open systems that can be easily checked, and then you have mix and match, not some sort of monoculture in your system, in your 5G system, then a lot of the problems that we have actually go away. Another initiative in terms of 5G security is one that we're building ourselves, and that's the Cyber Defense Campus 5G Security Lab. We're using two base stations provided by Marisoft and the 5G core by Open5GS to build our own laboratory. So we have this base station, we have the core, and then we can do more or less real-world security, not just on the software, not just on simulations. Right now we have a laboratory, it's a real thing, and you can find new loopholes, you can look at configuration problems, you can educate people. We use it also to train some cyber personnel on not only 5G, but also networking technologies in general. And we also really use it to develop more use cases for defense and law enforcement. This is a bit what it looks like. We have 3 different locations in the Cyber Defense Campus in Switzerland. We have connected them with 3 different internet service providers using a technology, secure network technology called Scion. We don't have time to get into this, but I recommend you check out the link, or you come to us after the talk. But what it means, we can combine our 5G lab and have it in distributed fashion, and also enable people remotely to access the lab and do security research on it. What's also interesting is that we're collaborating with the CCD COE here. We will use Scion to securely connect Estonia to LIN with our labs in Switzerland, and also extend access to the Cyber Defense Campus 5G lab here. This brings me to my conclusion and takeaways. I hope I've shown you that 5G networks are certainly still exposed to many threats, mainly those identified previously in 4G, because that's what we're mostly using and will be using for the foreseeable future. It's 2023, but I've seen plans that 2030 is often a target where some mobile network operators want to have their own 5G standalone systems. So I think a lot more security research is needed. It's a lot. 5G has, I think, way over 1,000 pages of specifications, and they're actually having more and more. It's very difficult to understand this completely, to formally verify it. So we will find more issues at the margins, I think, in the future, and there's a lot more research to be done. Thank you for listening. Any questions then later. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Martin. So we had two nice academic research and academic papers. Last but not least, it's Prajwol Kumar Nakarmi, and he's coming from industry. He's a strategic project manager at Ericsson. He's responsible for security and privacy controls in Ericsson's radio access network products. Since joining Ericsson in 2011 as a security researcher, he has worked with many aspects of mobile network security, including privacy-enhancing mechanisms, security architectures. He has been an active member of the Ericsson 4G, 5G security standardization team in 3GPP, and Prajwol is partly proud of his contributions to privacy enhancements in 5G, with solutions against IMSI catches. From 2022, in his role as strategic product manager, he is on a mission to ensure that the security posture of Ericsson products is second to none. Prajwol Kumar Nakarmi will present on 5G air interface security, dealing with the air interface security keys, but he also will touch upon IMSI catches and jamming of radio signals. So, Prajwol, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Erwin. So, I'm very glad that I'm here, and thank you all for staying up to now. And this is my slide. I will be talking about and my name is But this is not very readable for human users, right? Why is that? Come on.
It's in a different format.
Sorry?
It's in a different, it's not in ASCII.
Yeah, different encoding.
Yes, encoding.
Yeah, maybe closer to that. But maybe in a security, what is the basis of security? What is C in CIA? Yeah, exactly, confidentiality protection. And we could not read it because there was encryption, right? It was encrypted. And this is what I want to start. We'll talk about 4G and 5G, but this is the basis of cellular security that we have encryption like built into the air interface. It's the generally transformation of the message. We all know it in a way that only authorized parties can make sense of it. And on the right-hand side, I put a picture. The intention is not to look at the details of it, but in general, on the top, there are many inputs. In the middle, there is a security key going in, and then we get a key stream, and then we XOR with the plain text, and we get the encryption. That's how stream cipher work in 4G and 5G. And what we have in 4G, 5G is several 128-bit encryption algorithms. And they are based on Snow 3G, and AES is very popular. We use that in counter mode, and then Zook. And the first two are mandatory to implement. So all our phones and base stations, they must implement these two algorithms. And we generally, in cellular security, we have multiple algorithms so that if one breaks just in case, then we have another to fall back. And the last one, Zook, is mainly used in China and not elsewhere. And then this is the symmetric crypto, and we can debate whether this is a good idea or a bad idea. But we have seen in the industry, and I can dare to say that this is the best idea, that we have symmetric crypto for air interface encryption. And then what about 256-bit? We don't need it right now, but it's better to be prepared than be sorry. So discussions are going on in the industry about introducing 256-bit keys, but not for the reason that 128-bit keys are insecure, but mainly for the reason that we need more software-friendly algorithms, because we are moving to more clouds and so on, and we are taking this opportunity to increase the key length also. Okay, so yeah, there was a slide. It was encrypted, and that's what we saw in the middle. And if we do it, since it's a symmetric crypto, we can feed the encrypted text and we then get the plain text, right? So this is the slide. Now we can read it. I will talk about 4G and 5G, mainly on the 5G standalone, as we just heard from the previous speaker. And when we talk about non-standalone and 4G, for the purpose of this presentation, the security posture is the same. So 4G is equal to NSA that we call from the security perspective. And 5G is standalone. And my name is Prajwol. I work at Ericsson, and I also am a panelist in the Coordinated Vulnerability Disclosure Program in GSMA. But is it really true? Am I really Prajwol? Maybe I'm not. I gave the slide to Erwin and Carlis, and maybe they have modified the slide. So maybe I will not talk about this and talk about Harry Potter, maybe. How do we know that I will talk about these things? Cannot know, right? And this is where this little things in the bottom comes into play. And then we go into another basic security principle called integrity protection. So in the air interface, we have control plane, we have user plane, and they both are integrity protected. And the purpose of this security principle, is that the receiver can know if some authorized parties have modified the content, right? So if someone modified, then we should be able to know. And then we have, again, 3 algorithms, both in 4G, 5G, based on Snow 3G. Second one is AES, now in CMAC mode, because we have to do the message authentication code. And then another one is based on Zook. But even though the algorithms are 128 bits, we truncate the message authentication code to 32-bit to save the bandwidth on the air. This is a symmetric crypto, and the same thing for 256-bit. Discussions are going on to introduce this higher length. And in the picture, we put the input. Something happens there. And then we get the message authentication code. And now the receiver can do the same thing. And if the message authentication codes match, then we know that no one has modified the content. And that's why, yes, this is the presentation about 4G and 5G. And my name is Prajwol, and we will talk about this. Yeah. So moving on, the mobile network we all know, as you look, very simplified version like this. We have a mobile phone, we have a radio access network. They are base stations that our phones wirelessly connect to. Then we have a core network, right? In the core network, on a high level, we have a roaming network and a home network. So if you are at your home, then the both are same. But if you are going to another country, or even in the same country, if you are roaming to another operator, then it is called the roaming network. And then we have the home network. And what I will talk about today is not about anything except the link between mobile phone and the radio access network. And that link has many names. You can call it air interface. It's also called UU interface, formerly in 3GPP standards. You can call access stratum, radio interface, or in 5G we call new radio NR, and in LTE it was called EUTRA, and so on. So my outline for today is following. I will talk about security of the air interface, and on that I will focus on protocol stack, algorithms, and keys, very, very high level, because we have a limited number of time. I will talk about privacy, assurance, IMSI catchers, and radio jammers. There are many, as we heard, there are many security standards by 3GPP, and it might not be easy for everyone to understand, but in general, for the air interface, you can look at some of the standards, and the one on the leftmost side is the 33501, is the Bible of 5G security. That was a passing note. So this is the start of our security journey. We saw the network as before. And the first thing is that we have multi-layer security contexts. So there is no one layer of security that you break and you are happy. The attacker has to, as a security community, have many layers of security inside the 5G network. The first one is end-to-end between mobile phone and the home network. So if you have a subscription from AT&T or Vodafone and you have a SIM card, then the security is first of all bootstrapped between their mobile phone and your home operator, AT&T or Vodafone, right? So that is the basis of everything that we do afterwards. After that, as I said, you can roam. If you roam, then there is another security that is derived from the home network security, and then you have another layer of security with the device and the core network of the roaming network. And after that, the purpose of our talk, we have a phone and then radio access network. And then you even derive further from the security context, you have the radio access or access stratum security context. So if the attacker tries to break into the air interface, you can do it maybe for some reason, for some time, but then the system will recover because we have another layer of security. And you can break the roaming network security context, but you can also recover using the home network. So that is how it works. And In 5G, this is starting from 3G, that we have mutual authentication. So before we connect to the mobile network, our phones authenticate the network, and the network authenticates the phone. So it's not one-sided authentication. Both authenticate each other. And what is very, very good in 5G, as we also heard from Martin before, in 4G, we did not have this home authentication. So it was only the roaming network that authenticated the device, and home network had to trust. And yeah, there could be some fraud use cases. But in 5G, we removed this middle layer, so the authentication is done end-to-end from the mobile phone to the home network. And then we have service binding, so you cannot use the keys that you derive for 5G into 3G or 4G. So those keys are specific to the service that you are getting. Other fantastic features are also secure algorithm negotiation. So yeah, I showed we have 3 algorithms, and we also have secure algorithm negotiation, meaning that attacker cannot trick the mobile phone or the network to use another algorithm than what was initially intended. So there is no bidding down attack on the algorithms. And this is enabled by integrity protected signaling. So as we saw, integrity protection means that the receiver can know if someone has modified the content. So since the signaling, the control plane is integrity protected, we cannot have bidding down attacks. Now I go to the protocol stack, and this is the main problem whenever we talk about cellular network, that there are lots of acronyms, right? And I could have spelled out all these acronyms, but I decided not to do that because we don't need to know what they mean. So on general, they have physical layer, MAC layer, and we call physical layer layer 1, MAC layer, and RLC layer 2. But for our interest, so that's why I expanded the height of this PDCP, and we don't need to know the acronym of it. So that is where all the security happen. So PDCP is responsible for encryption, for integrity, and also for replay protection, that you cannot send the same messages more than once. And this means that everything below PDCP do not have protection. So you might have seen lots of attack papers saying, there is no protection in physical layer or MAC layer, and you can send malicious messages and so on. Yeah, it was a conscious decision that was made, and there is only limited number of things you can do. So it is no surprise, that's what I want to say. So above PDCP, we have security. That's where security starts. And IP and STAP on the left-hand side, they are on the user plane. RRC and NAS are on the control plane, and we don't need to know more than that for the purpose of today. And only for some crypto people, I'm sure we have some here. So which one do we do first? Do we encrypt first, or do we do integrity protection first? Right? And it might be, different people might have different opinions, but there are also academics who have looked into this. Anyway, on the air interface, we encrypt first, and then we integrity protect first, and then we encrypt later. So it's called ATE, authenticate, then encrypt. And Martin also touched on this before me. So before 5G, in 4G, user plane was not integrity protected. So if you were watching YouTube video, someone could flip a bit, and your video will be maybe distorted. And that could not have been detected in 4G. But if you take the same thing into IoT devices that 5G is enabling now, more than before, then this flipping bit is more serious problem, right? Than modifying 1 pixel in the YouTube or Netflix is not that big deal. But if there was an IoT signal or saying open the door or close the door, maybe 1 bit will completely change the use case. And that's why we need, the need for integrity protection is more in 5G. And yeah, we introduced user plane integrity protection in 5G. This is new. And this is, operator can control this. Either they can decide to have it required, preferred, or not needed. So the gist of the slide is that PDCP is where encryption and integrity happens. Briefly touching about security keys. I told that algorithms are 128 bits, but the keys are 256 bit. So we are prepared for future when we introduce 256-bit keys, but they are truncated today before use to 128 bit. We have a channel binding, the radio properties of the channel that the messages are happening, the keys are bound to that, and you cannot just steal 1 key from 1 base station, go to another and use it somewhere else. And then we can have the key change on the fly, and the 2 bullets I mentioned here is a bit different than the terminology that we use elsewhere in the industry. For example, in IETF, we have a different notion of forward and backward security there. And this is unfortunate that we don't have alignment. But anyway, in 3GPP, we have a concept of backward security that the new node does not know the key in the old node. And forward security is where the old node does not know the key used in the new node. So we have this separation, backward and forward security. And I knew that after I reach this slide, I will get thirsty. And I need to drink water. But I also knew that you will be bored while I drink the water. So I made a little puzzle for you to solve. So on the left-hand side, we have a parent node. There is a root key. You derive an old key from that. So there is an old child node. And you derive another key from that child node. We call it refresh. So we have a new child node key. On the right-hand side, you have the same scenario. You have the root key. You get the old key. But for the new child node, you don't derive using the old key, but you go to the parent and get the new key from there. So while I drink water, the question for you is, which of the below provides forward security between child nodes? Please make me proud. All right, so did you have an answer? Right. And why is that? Yeah, right. Thanks a lot, Carlos, for this. So you solved the puzzle. So the right-hand side provides the forward security when we get the keys directly from the parent. So the old node doesn't know what keys. So even if you compromise one node, what I'm willing to say is that it's not enough that you compromise one node. We have many protections built in to have these separations and so on. Now, we move into privacy, and this is what I'm very, very proud that I was born in this era and I could contribute to this. This is the first thing that happened in maybe 30 years in the history of our cellular network. Before 5G, our IMSI, as we heard before, was always transmitted in clear text, and it took us so long to finally encrypt this permanent identifier that transfers over the air. So in 5G, we call it SUSI. Some people call it SUKI, but you can trust me on this. In the 3GPP, we decided to call it SUSI. It's also fun to say it's SUSI than SUKI. So that is what is transmitted over the air. It goes all the way to the radio access network. So even the base station doesn't know what it is. It is encrypted. It goes to the roaming network. Roaming network doesn't know what it is. It will go all the way to the home network, and only home network can decrypt this. And you might ask then, the SUPI means the clear text identifier. So it goes back to the roaming network. And you can say, why is that done? So I don't want to go into more details, but that is what is required by law, because in a democratic society, we also need to do lawful intercepts for policies and so on. So to make that happen, this home network needs to give the clear text information to the roaming network. Briefly, the SUPI, the identifiers are in two formats, IMSI and NAI, and you can see here, I just wanted to mention that the identifier of the mobile network is not encrypted. It is only the identifier of the phone, a particular subscription that is encrypted. So you can know if some SUSI belongs to AT&T, Vodafone, and so on. You can know that, but you cannot know which of the subscription it is. So only that part is encrypted. Yeah. And then temporary identifiers. Before this is very good. It has been there since 2G, but we made a very big enhancement in 5G. We use it more in a greater length and also made it strictly temporary. So in this diagram, I will follow some steps. So our phones are not constantly connected to the mobile network, right? You know why? Because the battery will go off if it's constantly connected, right? So when there is an inactivity timer, it goes to sleep. And now and then it wakes up and say, okay, do I have a new message or not? If it doesn't have a new message, it goes to sleep again. And then between this, if there's a new data like incoming call or I don't know, chats or so on, then the network knows that the mobile phone is not connected, and then it sends the message is called paging. It pages the message. And then at that time, the mobile phone also, if it happens to wake up, it will know, okay, there's a message for me, and then it will respond, right? So this is this called paging procedures. But the problem here is that the time that the mobile phone wakes up to check that if it has data or not, those before 5G, they were based on the permanent identifier, and they were deterministic. So even though we encrypt the permanent identifier, if we still make this timing deterministic, then attackers can still track subscriptions. So in 5G, we close this hole. So now they are based on temporary identifiers. That's why greater use. And these timings are ephemeral, so they keep on changing. And the second, it's not enough to do this. You see the second line there. When you paste the mobile network before 5G sends permanent identifier, there was a mechanism to send permanent identifier. We removed that in 5G, so it's only temporary identifier in this paging message. And finally, the temporary identifier is no good if you keep it for 1 year, right? It becomes another permanent identifier. So in 5G, we made it mandatory to assign new temporary identifiers in a certain event. So you can see that looking at the holistic view, we fixed temporary identifier in 5G. Another topic I want to deal with before going to IMSI catchers and radio jamming is security assurance. And this is, on high level, ensures that the equipment you buy from Ericsson or Nokia or Samsung, whoever, that they follow the standards, the security controls are properly implemented, and that they have a good development process, right? That they don't do insecure coding, for example, and so on. And for that, we have two things. One is the security assurance specification that is defined by 3GPP. They define the test cases. And then GSMA defines the vendor process, this requirement and audit. And on together, when you combine this, then you can know that the equipment that they buy from Ericsson, for example, are assured, and you can trust them to do the right thing. So last two topics on the air interface. We cannot have an air interface security talk without talking about IMSI catchers. And here, things are not only on paper. We have seen things from United States that Department of Defense, Homeland Security, had admitted that they know that there are IMSI catchers, for example, around Washington, D.C., but at that time, they did not have means to detect those or to mitigate those. We also know recently in this war of Russia and with Ukraine that Ukrainian soldiers were getting fake SMS messages saying, run away or go and kill your commander. So IMSI catchers were used for these purposes. We also know recently in Paris, there was an incident when people were afraid that someone had a bomb in the car. And when they investigated, it was not a bomb, but it was IMSI catcher. It was used for health insurance fraud, that lots of messages were being sent to the people. In Norway, there were many resources of seeing IMSI catchers around the Parliament building and so on. And just recently, NRK had an article showing Russian embassy have suspicious antennas on top of the rooftops, and they were being used as IMSI catchers and so on. Yeah, so this is the real thing. And how do we detect it is so we have lots of security controls that we saw before. And what I'm going to say now is about the detection. So we have the devices or mobile phones in the middle. We have a legitimate base station and the legitimate on the right-hand side, and the neighboring cell base station on the left-hand side. And we have this procedure that the network can ask for regular measurements with the devices, and then device collect the information and give back to the network. And when the false test, and the information goes back to the legitimate base stations. So if the IMSI catcher comes in the neighborhood, then there is a mechanism, right? This measurement reporting you see on the lower hand side, this will contain this information of the IMSI catcher also, like the cell identifiers and so on. And the network can detect these IMSI catchers locally or extract these information and detect it somewhere else. And this is the solution that Ericsson drove. It is in the 5G standard, not mandatory to implement, but it's in we call it informative in standards. So this uses existing measurement reporting procedures. It has been existing from 2G to 5G, so we don't need any specialized phones to make this happen. So operator can do that because the data is already there. We just need a new mechanism to handle those data for security purpose. And it is reliable. You might also have heard of Android apps like Snoop Sneeze or some specialized phone called crypto phones that claim to detect IMSI catchers on the phone. But the problem with those phone-based detection is that you might have lots of false positives. And with the network-based, since the network knows how the cell topologies are and where are they placed, and it's more reliable, you have less or no false positive. And then my final topic is about radio jammers. We have heard about this also a couple of times in this SciCon. So in general, what they do is a physical layer attack, and the purpose is to cause the denial of service. And they do that by compromising the link's availability. So as you saw in the figure, very simplistic diagram, you have a jammer. It can transmit higher in this local area, and the power decreases as you go out, but then it disrupts the communication of the radio. And that is one of the mechanisms that attackers use to beat down, to force the mobile phones to leave 5G and go to 2G, for example. And then the second bullet is what I want to say, is that 3GPP doesn't mention radio jamming, anti-radio jamming techniques, but it doesn't mean that we don't have any features for that. So features to avoid interference, right? Generally, they will also improve the robustness against jamming. And one example of this is spatial beamforming. So if you are beamforming, then the jamming that is transmitting on all the directions will have less impact on those beamform signals. So there are some techniques like that. You have interference, rejection combining, carrier aggregation, mobility, et cetera, et cetera. And then, of course, you can also, in the factory or 5G, private 5G sectors, you can have you can increase the wall loss by having radio frequency fencing or restricting the jammers to come inside the factory and so on. And then there are different kinds of radio jammers, and we can do things to detect those. Barrage jammers, smart and intelligent jammers. I will not, for the sake of the time, I will not go into more details, but just the thing that the amount of techniques we need increases as we go from barrage to the intelligence jammer, and Ericsson is currently engaged in internal researches and tests to do detection of radio jamming. And my key takeaway is 5G enables the most secure and trustworthy mobile network to date. I hope you are convinced, and I'm willing to debate on that. And you may also ask what more security and privacy features will come in 6G, for example, or in future. Then it's a cliffhanger for you, and yeah, just be assured that Ericsson is on it. So thank you. You can find me on LinkedIn. I will be happy to have discussion afterward.
So this leaves us time for some questions. I don't know if in the audience somebody already wants to start off with a first question to one or all three of our panelists. I see gentlemen in the middle of the hallway.
So, thank you for this great presentation. You might have a chance to start debating that 5G is secure or not. So, a different point of view. But my question goes to Mr. Staggs regarding to the security of DJI drones. I had a chance to read your research paper, and but I have to mention that your colleague's research paper was published last year, and if for that this research paper also based on 5 years old research made by David Potzner. So my question is that your conclusion in your research paper is still valid or not? Because I think reversing signals is based on the framework made by a DJI company. Is highly dependent on and still valid or not?
Yep, thank you for the question. So you're absolutely right. Our research is based on that work. However, the key takeaway from our paper is that we actually made it work on lower cost, easier to come by software-defined radios like the HAC RF instead of the ATIS software-defined radio. So we took that work, ported it over to Python, and we basically got to work on other SDRs that are easier to come by. Connor, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Yes, and I think something else to add is we were really trying to hone in on making it a real-time detection system while also just factoring in portability and just like some other factors as well. We wanted like an actual working product, and other things have just been proof of concepts that haven't really been increasing detection ranges or anything like that.
Okay, thank you for your answer.
Erwin, if I may briefly.
Yeah, of course, Martin.
There's also some good work at NDSS this year that built upon this. They also looked at the drones itself of the whole DJI ecosystem. We also looked a bit at it. We have an aeroscope, and the whole thing is completely insecure, as has been described, right? So it's still valid. Like you can even go and do it the other way around. You can spoof any sort of drones to the aeroscope. So, in my opinion, it's fairly useless for any motivated attacker. But of course, if we're talking about scale, if the threat model is we need hundreds and thousands of ready-made drones from DJI and we use them, then it may have some use. But you can just build your own drone and just not send drone ID or remote ID. And it's fairly useless against such a motivated adversary, right?
Yeah, just to add on that, you're absolutely right. From an integrity standpoint, there's nothing stopping from somebody for spoofing these remote ID beacons to create what they would call ghost drones, if you will. And it's the same issue that ADSB and AIS for maritime environment suffers from. So 100% agree.
Thank you for the elaboration on this one. I see this gentleman there has another question.
Hello, and thank you again for coming in here. And actually, you were the reason how I found out about the Cycon. So thank you for the intro into the Cycon. I have a quick question regarding the range. Does it solely depend on the antenna that you choose, or there's any other hardware or software limitations in terms of the range for identifying the drones? Because as we see with the current conflict, the gray line, the gray area between the enemy and the other fighting part is a bit longer than 1 mile. Yes, thank you.
Thanks for the question. Excellent question. Yeah, for proof of concept purposes, we could definitely do more in terms of trying to figure out a better antenna versus just purchasing an off the market one. We could look at making custom antennas and doing better things with filtering and signals processing with some of our demodulation work. So there's definitely some room to grow from that standpoint. That's something we'll continue to push for. Because like you said, at that range, it's not, as useful as it could be, like an aeroscope system that works 20 and 30 miles out. So, Connor, I don't know if you want to add anything to that one.
No, you said everything.
Does that answer your question? Okay. Somebody else has a question? I see there in the back.
Hello, I'm Marius Georgievich from NATO CCDCOE Technology Branch, dealing with mostly 5G security projects. This is a question for Mr. Prajwol. So our focus is mainly for military application of 5G and see if it's reliable or not and secure enough. And one focus is indeed in the vulnerability of possibility to have false base station, similar with LTE scenario. I was mainly interested in the technical report 33809, which is security enhancement against false base station. It's been on the development since release 16, still not yet ready. We are at release 18. The research brings a lot of mitigation against this type of threats. Can you tell me about, if you are familiar with this report, I'm sure you are, what is the status of it, and if you see it will be able to become a standard? Thank you.
Thank you for the question, and very specific question. So I was still in 3GPP when that report was started, as you said, long time ago. And now it has not finished. And the main reason is that 3GPP is not a single company driven. It's consisted of operators, regulators, mobile phone vendors, network equipment vendors, and so on. And it's a consensus-based organization. And that's why things are not as fast as everyone expects it to be. So this study is going to be closed now. I have written some blog post about what came out of that study. You can find it in Ericsson.com. But the major changes will not happen now because 3GPP could not reach on consensus. And so there is no major technical specification that will come out of this TR. It's just a technical report. And as you should also understand that report contains lots of vulnerabilities, right? That does not mean that it is acknowledged by 3GPP that those are vulnerabilities. It was just an attempt to see if you can further improve on anything. So all the key issues and solutions you see there are just brought up by some companies, and it's not acknowledged by whole 3GPP that these are the vulnerabilities. So things are not as bad. If you see like 25 different vulnerabilities in that TR, it doesn't mean that that 5G is that bad. Yeah.
Okay, if this answers your question, I see there's maybe one more there in the front. There in the very front. Okay, let's start with you, sir. That's okay.
Yeah, okay. Thorsten Zengerle, the solution about IMSI catcher which you presented, is this something pure to your company, to Ericsson, or is it something to be implemented on the overall network independent from which vendor? The question behind is if that helps, what it seems, why it's not coming by regulation, why it's not coming as a secure, let's say, need to be implemented.
If I understand, are you asking about the detection or the problem?
The problem, and I thought you have a solution for that one.
Yeah, exactly. So thank you for the question. And the problem is not a vendor specific. It is how the technology is built as today. So today it is, in summary, if you buy Nokia, Ericsson, Samsung, anything, those IMSI catcher problems and LTE and the remaining problems in 5G, they are agnostic to the vendor. So it's the technology. Or did I answer the question? Or? And yeah, maybe just the second part is that regulators can maybe do more if you want to have more. Like for example, we heard 805, 33809 is not moving as fast as we all wish. So if there are more interest, then maybe those interested parties should also influence 3GPP more than today.
So I think it was a question here in the front. I don't know if you have a mic.
Thank you. My question is to Jason and Connor. Thank you very much for your very nice presentation. Actually, we are a group from Ukraine, and we visited this session because of your topic announced in the proceedings. Thank you very much. And as far as we are a little bit more closer that many people from this audience to the front line, we have on close connections with our brothers in arms and so on. I will support your conclusions in very great extent, especially the question from my colleague Andriy about the gray zone and so on. And to provide some details before my question, I need to emphasize this, that importance of your research is essentially high because it's a question of everyday lives and death, of maybe hundreds or dozens of operators of drones because of this aeroscope used by Russians against Ukrainian forces and so on. For example, it's not a great secret that approximately every day hundreds of DJI-made drones are lost due to aeroscope intercept and radio jamming and so on. That is why it's maybe hottest topics on the level of platoon, for example, in this war. And we are very interested in this. We are a little bit connected to this, and we will continue cooperation with you, of course. And my question is related with current experience that on frontline, both sides use a whole zoo of platforms, from small scale to large scale, from so-called commodity to agriculture, targeted and so on, and from other manufacturers also, not only DJI, for example, Autel and others, and many of them do not use aeroscope, of course, but maybe, my question is, maybe you investigate different kinds of these drones from DJI. You mentioned in the table, I saw several of them, but the list of models is much bigger. And maybe you investigate other manufacturers also on these so-called vulnerabilities and so on. Thank you much.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And this is something Connor and I have discussed quite a bit, actually, is looking at other manufacturers, other vendors, and seeing how they're addressing the remote identification requirement and trying to, maybe perhaps build a comprehensive solution that sort of incorporates all of them. But there's so many different implementations out there. There's open source versions that standards that people are trying to push for. So it's very much a moving target at this point, but thank you for the question.
So what I'd always like is there's so many questions means that the audience is very interested. The downside of it is we unfortunately have to stop the session now because we're running out of time. But before leaving, I want to thank Jason, Connor, Martin, and Prajwol once more with a nice round of applause for the wonderful presentations they did. So thank you all.